morning, everybody. We'll do this little sound check here. So if you're getting some kind of strange noises or you're not getting a good audio, well, let me know via the live chat here as quick as you can. I'll keep talking a little bit here this morning. We'll get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way, and then we're going to talk some today about carrying capacity and just sort of raising science in general. So let me know if the audio feed is coming in okay. In the meantime, Ozzy's with us today. He's with me every day here in the office, as well as Earl on the wall there. So am I coming in okay? Can you hear? We'll wait through the time delay here and get on with everything. Just pop me in okay. Getting your audio scratchy, you're hearing okay, getting static again. How's this? Sound isn't too good again, but I can hear you. Okay, a little fuzzy again. Well, we will. We'll try and get through this. I will see if I can find another piece of audio equipment and see if that'll work. I'm not quite sure. It may be the system, what I'm hearing. We just got some reports back yesterday on Canvas and on live Zoom from faculty around campus, and it is absolutely evidently turning into a bloody disaster. It's crashing right and left. I don't know if you guys have had any experience with it or not, but it's boy, the whole thing is at least on campus is really pretty flimsy right now, the system, and that could be what's going on with YouTube as well. I'm not certain. It could be our internet that we're going through here on campus as well. So I will try and speak. Hopefully this thing will clear up a little bit, and I'll see if I can get some new equipment just to check and see if that's not what the issue is. So so that was a little bit of the housekeeping, or at least a lead into the housekeeping. I did send you an email out yesterday. I think it was yesterday. On some of the newest stuff that we have going on that we've been told from the provost, and one of those things has to do with the pass-fail situation. They are going to make some kind of accommodations for pass-fail, for converting regular grades to pass-fail, but it is my understanding at this point in time, as of this morning, that you have to go through the entire process, get your grade at the end of the semester, and then petition the university to change your grade to pass-fail. So that may be of use for some students. It may be of little or no use, negative use for other students. But that's what they're telling us right now about the pass-fail. I know I had some questions on that first. So that's what I know at this point about the pass-fail issue. They did tell us too, and this was what I thought was going to happen. We're not going to be returning. If we're out for 30 days, that puts us back, with about a couple of weeks left of the regular semester, and so they're not going to bring everybody back, all the students back for 2 weeks in the semester. So that's what it looks like at this point, unless something drastic changes. If it does, I'll try and let you know as soon as I know. Anyway, I'm not sure if they've made these things known to students yet or not. There was a town hall last night on campus with faculty, and they had 500 slots. So I don't think that. I'm not sure that they've made all of this known to students yet or not. So you're getting it from me. There's a lot of strange things going on out there. We're getting reports. I haven't confirmed any of them yet. Maybe you guys could confirm some. We're getting reports that there are people that are returning dogs to animal shelters and taking them to kennels for short-term purposes because they're afraid they're going to get the coronavirus from their dogs, which seems a bit off the wall to me at this point in time. But I don't know, any of you guys, can you confirm any of those rumors that we're getting around here? If any of you can, just pop it on the live chat there, and I would appreciate it. So there's a lot of strange things going on, a lot of talk. Some of it's real, some of it's not. But with respect to the university stuff, you know as much as I know, and if it changes anytime sooner or later, I'll try and get that information to you as quickly as I can. So okay, you're not seeing it. Yeah, it is confirmed that you can't get it from dogs, but evidently there's some talk about people, or at least a few people trying to, or attempting get away to sequester themselves from their dogs. So it's not typically, it's not what we would call a zoonotic disease, where it just goes back and forth. But anyway, there's some strange things. So if you hear of those things actually happening, it would be good to know. I'm always trying to confirm everything. Hear some of these reports. So, okay, with that said, you're going to need the handout that I emailed out previously. I can't remember when it was. It's on carrying capacity and stocking rates. It's backwards. You can read backwards. Carrying capacity and stocking is backwards on my screen. So we're going to take a look at carrying capacity and stocking rates for the next couple of lectures. And then we'll have a couple of homeworks associated with it. And then we'll start kind of jumping around to some different subjects the rest of the way through. So, carrying capacity and stocking rates. The first question kind of that pops up in most people's minds when you start talking about carrying capacity is like, so what? What does that mean for me? And so if you're a taxpayer, for instance, in the state of Nevada, this is a big deal. It affects you directly, whether you realize it or not. And having some kind of just basic understanding of it is good. If you have some basic understanding of it, then not only do you understand it yourself, but you can sort of explain some things to the uninitiated and the uninformed when it comes to this, and particularly the big item that comes up in conversations with respect to carrying capacity on rangelands in Nevada is the wild horse and burro controversy. A lot of people would like to call it a controversy, and a lot of people would like to make it a controversy. But this comes up all the time in conversations when we talk about wild horse and burro issues. It comes up quite often in wildlife cases. You know, when we start talking about elk, of course, Nevada has an elk plan. It doesn't get a lot of airtime much anymore, but there was a time when Nevada had a big sort of controversial issue going on with elk in Nevada. And so, you know, the question is always, well, how many critters, wild and domestic, and in the case of wild horses and burros, feral animals, what is the carrying capacity of Nevada's rangelands? It's a very, very complex question. It's not complicated. It's not hard. It's not difficult. It's just complex, like most situations most kinds of planning processes are complex. Whether we were talking about critters on rangelands in Nevada, or whether we're talking about putting together a nutrition and inventory and drug inventory program at a vet office. It's complex. And so we're going to try and give you a basic, at least a very basic understanding of carrying capacities and stocking rates and how these things are derived. And so that's what we're going to do for the next couple of days. There are three components to the grazing or the foraging process for rangeland animals. And to one degree or another, it's true for all animals, but particularly animals that are foraging on their own. There are three components that we have to understand to begin with. Number one is timing. In other words, when are the animals in a particular seasonal habitat? When do we turn them out? Well, in the case, for instance, let's use the three large groups of foraging herbivores on our rangelands. Let's take domestic animals, cattle and sheep primarily. Let's take big game animals, and let's take wild horses and burros. In the case of timing, when it comes to grazing, with domestic animals as an example, typically in the Great Basin, typically in Nevada and most of the Intermountain West, we use federal lands, our public lands, as seasonal habitats. In other words, the domestic animals aren't there, they're not on a particular piece of rangeland all year long. Excuse me. They are turned out at a specific time of the year. And right now, in most of Nevada, we're getting ready to turn out domestic animals onto their federal seasonal ranges. Usually it's somewhere around April the 1st. That varies from one operation to another, but usually about 2 weeks either side of April 1st is typically when we turn out onto our spring ranges in Nevada. Okay, so we're right there at that point in time. We turn them out. In the case of big game animals, timing is not a big issue because the animals are out there 12 months out of the year. We really can't control when they move on to a seasonal range and when they move off to a seasonal range, off of a seasonal range onto another seasonal range. A seasonal range is for big game wildlife typically works like this. They'll winter at lower elevations, and then as the snow and begins to melt, and as the weather warms up and it begins to green up at higher elevations, they just sort of follow the green up the mountainside. They don't respect fences. They jump over, they crawl under, they crawl through fences, and so they move around at their own will. And so we can't really control the timing of when they move from one seasonal habitat to another, like we can with domestic animals. Okay, and with wild horses and burros, our third category of critters out on our rangelands, we can't really. They're much like wildlife in the sense that we can't control the timing of when they use one seasonal range versus using another seasonal range. And so we really can't control the timing. But with domestic animals, we can control when we turn out. So we've got timing, okay? That's number one. Number two is duration. Three components to the grazing process. Timing is the first one. The second one we'll talk about now is duration. And this is something else that we can control with domestic animals. We could say, first of all, timing-wise, you can turn out, let's say, April the 1st onto your permit, and you have to be off of your permit, off of your piece of rangeland. Pick a date, July the 1st. That's pretty typical. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's earlier, depending on the situation. But it's a certain amount of time that domestic animals are allowed onto a federal permit. And so the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service, one of those two agencies, controls that. They tell a producer, a rancher, sheep man, they tell you when you can turn your domestic animals out and how long they can be in a certain area. And you're bound by an authorization. You can get fined if you violate that authorization. In the case of big game animals, once again, we can't really control the timing or control the duration because they're out there 12 months out of the year. They got to make a living 12 months in each year. So we really can't control when they are turned out, and we can't control how long they're out there. And wild horses and burros fall in that category as well. We can't control the timing, and we can't control the duration. They're out there. They can't be herded by law. Big game animals, at least in the Intermountain West, can't be herded by law. When you get down into some of the eastern states, things are a little bit different. You have a different perspective on things. In fact, in some of our eastern states, the wildlife animals are actually owned by the landowner and managed by the Game and Fish Department. So imagine the contention that can occur under those kind of situations. And in some states, they actually buy and sell deer, bucks, just like you would selling a bull, having a bull sale. It's a very, very different way of looking at the world. But in our neck of the woods, we can't control how long big game animals are out in any particular piece of rangeland, and we can't control how long horses and burros are out there. They're out there 12 months out of the year. Domestic animals, we can control both timing and duration. Okay? Now the third component to grazing and foraging is intensity. So there's timing, there's duration, and there's intensity. So intensity refers to basically how often a plant is bitten. Okay, how often a plant is bitten. And so this relates to how many animals you have, or a stocking rate. So if you have more animals in a pasture, the more likely it is that a single plant, that any given single plant is likely to be bitten. And the more you have, the longer they're out there, the longer the animals are out there in that area, the more likely a plant is going to be bitten a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time. And so the number of animals in any given area relates to the intensity, and the duration really relates to the intensity. How long are they out there? You can put a few animals in a large pasture, and they can stay out there longer and not have as great an intensity of grazing or foraging on the plants as you would if you put a whole lot of animals out there and left them out there for a shorter amount of time. So intensity relates to sort of the duration and the number of animals that are there and how often a plant gets bitten. And so how do we control intensity with domestic animals, with domestic animals? A producer is told when they can turn out, they're told how long they can be there, and they're also told how many animals they can turn out. Okay? You have a permit that has so many AUMs, authorized AUMs. That's an animal unit month that's associated with the permit. We're going to talk about AUMs, I think, in our next lecture. But it relates to the number of animals. So we control all three components of the grazing process, the grazing and foraging process, when it comes to domestic animals. We control the timing. We tell them when you can turn out. We control the duration. We say when you have to get off of an area or when you have to move to another area. And we control the intensity by controlling how many animals are turned out. In the case of domestic animals, if you have just, let's just pick a number. Let's say you have a 500 head cow-calf operation. You've got 500 head of mama cows. Each one of them has a calf every year. The next year, you can't bring those 500 offspring back. Okay, we don't do that. Typically, what ranchers do for the most part is they sell that offspring. So you're not building numbers over time, and they'll keep back some replacement heifers, depending on the size of their cow herd. And they will cull older cows as they get older and get less productive. They'll sell those cows. And so they keep the numbers that are turned out each year fairly constant. And that's regulated by the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service, either one. In some cases, state departments of agriculture also do a little bit of that. So we control all three of the components of the grazing process when it comes to domestic animals. Intensity, when it comes to big game animals. How do we control the intensity of the grazing process with big game animals? Well, we control their numbers. Just like a rancher would sell off offspring each year to maintain numbers. We control numbers of big game animals through the hunting process. If our populations get too high for the carrying capacity, then the Game and Fish typically will issue more permits, more hunting permits. So the take gets larger. That's the attempt, is to try and raise the number of animals that are harvested through the hunting process. And sometimes it really gets intense. I know in eastern Montana, when we lived up there years ago, there was about a 5-year period where you could go buy B tags, what they call B tags. These were additional depredation tags. You could get as many, if you were a resident, you could get as many as 4 at the cost of $5 each. So you could get 6 head of deer, a mule deer or whitetail, and they still had a difficult time trying to get enough people to harvest enough deer to make a difference in the population numbers. Eventually, they got those populations under control. But that's how we do it when it comes to big game animals. Is we control those populations through the hunting process. If a particular population management unit or within a particular population management unit, the numbers for whatever reason begin to decline, and that population becomes sort of hanging in the balance, and we start worrying about it crashing, then the Game and Fish Department of whatever state it may be will reduce the number of hunting tags on any given hunting unit. So that's how we control the intensity of grazing on public lands, on range lands of big game animals. Now let's take the third component that we're talking about, group of animals, and look at intensity. How do we control the intensity of wild horses and burros? Well, there's 2 main ways to do that. Number one is through the gather process. If the horse populations begin to grow to the point where they're beginning to have a negative impact on the habitats, seasonal habitats that they're using, then we as a society, we go out and we attempt a gather. We go through the gather process and we remove animals. We just go out and physically remove animals, live animals. In the case of wildlife, we go out and we remove deceased animals. But with wild horses and burros, we go out and we actually remove live animals. Or we can also control their populations to some extent through contraception. And that's something that we're going to talk about as we get a little bit further into the semester, quite a bit more on this horse and burro issue, because it serves as a great example of management complications and challenges that can occur. So, with the gather process, we go and we actually remove wild horses or burros. And we can also use contraception, and we can use a combination of both of those efforts. And so anything that reduces our ability or eliminates or truncates our ability to implement contraception measures or physical gathering of horses and removal, anything that gets in that way and impedes that process really inhibits our ability to make sure that our herds and our herd sizes aren't having serious impacts on the habitats that they use. And so we have a lot of a number, several, a couple of dozen maybe, horse advocacy groups, and I use the term loosely, that fight society in all kinds of ways when it comes to this removal of wild horses and burros. There's a lot of litigation that goes on each time a gather is scheduled. Almost all of them get litigated. They get delayed. Maybe they're delayed a year. Maybe they're delayed a couple of years. Maybe they're delayed indefinitely. And so this relates back to the number of horses that we have. If horses, and they do, have a fecundity rate or reproductive rate of about 20%, and right now we have about 100,000 horses on the ground, range wide, in the western states. In about another 30 days, 45 days, we're not going to have 100,000 horses. We're going to have 120,000 horses. So anything that impedes us, this year as an example, anything that impedes the removal of 20,000 horses is going to leave us with 100,000 horses on the ground. And so it's a little like paying the interest, but never paying down the principal. Our AML, our appropriate management level for horses, is about roughly about 35,000 on the high end, and so we're way over what we're 27,000. We're essentially past doubling what has been determined as the carrying capacity for wild horses and burros. So the question then arises this. I see the static's gone. This must be a ghost in the system somehow or another. The question becomes this for society, for people like you, taxpayers, that are concerned about animal welfare, is if we control the timing and the duration and the intensity for domestic animals, and we control the intensity of grazing and foraging on big game animals, why should we give wild horses and burros a pass? Why can't we control their intensity? Why do they get a special privilege compared to the other components that are out there, the other two big groups of large grazing animals, why are they treated differently? Why should they be treated differently? And so this question becomes problematic, and it's all wound up, for the most part, it's all wound up in what is the carrying capacity of our rangelands. And so, we have a lot of litigious groups out there that want to that think they have a better idea about what the carrying capacity is and how the carrying capacity should be divided up amongst these three groups of large grazing animals that are out on our public lands. And so that's just sort of to whet your appetite on it. But we have to have in order to really understand that challenge, we have to have at least a very crude understanding of how carrying capacity is determined on our public lands and on rangelands in general. Okay? So we've got timing, we've got duration, and we've got intensity. Those are the three major components when it comes to the grazing process, the foraging process out on rangelands. Now, we have some principles of grazing management, a few of them right here. Well, I've got 4 of them listed for you on your handout. Number 1, use appropriate grazing system and the species and class of animal. We haven't talked about grazing systems yet. We're going to talk about them very briefly, probably next week. But there are systems for grazing domestic animals. And then we need to be concerned about the species or class of animals. We want to make sure that all of these things fit the habitat that we're using. By species and class of animals, we're talking about, are we grazing cattle or sheep? Are we grazing steers? Are we grazing, mama cows? Are we grazing yearlings? What are we? What class of animal is actually out there? Species and class of animal. Number 2, use the appropriate timing of grazing. We've talked about that. You've got to turn animals out, domestic animals out, during a time period when it's appropriate. And when it's appropriate is based on the plant community characteristics. For instance, salt desert shrub communities. Salt desert shrub communities in Nevada are great, really nice winter range, but they're not very good spring and summer range. We're talking about 5 to 8 inch rainfall zones. It rains in the wintertime, and so most of the plants do all their growing in the spring. And so turning animals out into salt desert shrub in the spring, when these species of foraging plants, or forage plants, not foraging plants, I guess a foraging plant would be a Venus flytrap, right? We don't want to turn animals out in the spring in these salt desert shrub communities that we have lots of places in Nevada, because it's a very short window that these plants have to reproduce and to produce tissues during that period of time. So we wait until that's over, and then we turn animals out to graze in these types of communities after the plants have senesced for the year, for the year. So we have to use the appropriate timing of grazing. Number 3, we use appropriate distribution procedures within the grazing system. In other words, if we have a pasture that's 8 miles long and a mile wide, and it has water at one end of the pasture, which end of that pasture is going to get the most use? The end of the pasture where the water is, right? And so our distribution of the grazing animals is going to be tilted toward the end of the pasture that has the water in it. And so we as a manager have to understand that, and so it would be good if we could put some water on the other end of the pasture, or if we could put some salt or supplement or mineral block on the other end of the pasture, where the animals have to move back and forth along the whole length of that 8 mile pasture. You'll get a better distribution pattern of utilization out there. So we want to use the appropriate distribution procedures within the grazing system. That's just one example of a distribution procedure. And number 4, we want to use the appropriate stocking rate. We want to put the appropriate number of animals out there for the appropriate number of time, for the appropriate amount of time that we're grazing. So those are some principles of grazing management. I was told a long time ago, a very, very long time ago, that the first rule of rangeland management was to close the gate. And that's not far from being completely true. Close the gate at the right time, open the gate at the right time, and you'll be a whole lot better off. So the rate, the intensity, the scale, and the principles of these principles have to be based on the management objectives of any given area. Your management objectives, when you're talking about wild animals, you're talking about domestic animals, or you're talking about feral animals like wild horses and burros, your management is based on objectives for the habitat. Management has to be based on objectives for the habitat first. You may have some objectives for the animals, but if the habitat is not in place, having objectives for the animals becomes a moot point. So it all has to be based on objectives for the habitat. So carrying capacity, or the grazing capacity, or the foraging capacity, you could use that term as well, is really the number of animals, livestock, wildlife, and horses and burros, wild horses and burros, that a given area, that a given piece of rangeland can support or sustain. And by support, I mean sustain. It has to be sustainable. It has to be sustainable. And so why would we, what are reasons why we would want to determine the carrying capacity of any given piece of rangeland? And I've got a few of them listed here. I've got a half a dozen of them listed. Of why you might want to do it. Sometimes climate fluctuates. Sometimes we get into these drought sequences like the Dust Bowl, and you need to reevaluate. Sometimes the species composition of plant communities changes over time. That's just called successional dynamics. They just change over time. As sagebrush plants grow older and more dense, the understory begins to decline. The actual grazing potential of the area begins to decline. It's just a natural process, and we learn how to manage that natural process. Wildlife abundance increases or decreases. Sometimes that happens, and we have to reassess what carrying capacities are. Changes in management scenarios, land ownership transfers. If you're going to go buy a ranch, you bloody well better have somebody go out there and make an assessment about what the carrying capacity is, and not just take the word of the previous owner. That's a good reason for reassessing carrying capacity. And sometimes we just do it for time. If you're having on a federal permit, there's permit renewals supposedly that happen every 10 years. So you need to get your permit renewed. Sometimes there's range management plans for whole districts or forests that get reassessed. So there's all kinds of reasons for wanting to reassess what the carrying capacity is for any given piece of rangeland. Now, the problem with carrying capacity and determining carrying capacity, the one major problem, the problem that everything centers around when you're determining carrying capacity, is that it has been and it remains one of the most confusing, least precise range management activities that we have. It is hard to figure out. There's not even one way to do it. There's a number of ways to do it. How do you determine what the carrying capacity is? Well, obviously, somehow you have to go and measure it. You've got to get some kind of a real life assessment, a mathematical assessment of what the production potential is for an area. Now, the first problem with it is this. Is it the same every year? Let's just pick a hypothetical ranch that has a hypothetical number of pastures in it, that have a hypothetical number of ecological sites in it. If you calculated the carrying capacity every year for 20 years, you're probably not going to get 1 year where you're going to get anywhere near the average. And you're certainly not going to get any identical years. Why is that? Well, rainfall patterns are different every year, aren't they? The timing, the seasonality of precipitation, the amount of precipitation, the ambient air temperature. You get these old cold years, some years where you just don't, you may not even get a summer in some places. I remember the summer of '93 never came in Wyoming. It was cold all summer. And so temperature is going to limit the precipitation, or the effect of any precipitation that you're going to get on the photosynthetic process. So photosynthesis is affected by the weather. Hot, cold, how much precip you get, when you get the precip, how often you get the precip. It varies from 1 year to the next what you're going to get and what's available for animals. Even if you measure it precisely, it's going to be different every year. And so that becomes that makes things kind of difficult to sort of figure it out. I mean, it's a bloody moving target. It's the Heisenberg principle. Annual fluctuations, seasonal fluctuations, successional dynamics. And so with all this variability out there, whatever the assessment, it's got to conform to promoting a healthy resource. It has to be, and on public lands, it's legally mandated. It has to be done. And so how do you do it? How do you measure the production on grasses? How do you measure the production on shrubs and get a good assessment of it? We have methods for doing that have been determined over several decades. Some of them are better than others. Some of them fit some scenarios better than others. Some fit some plant communities better than others. And so it's just a very, very complex process. How do you go about doing it? They vary widely in their techniques. And so, this sort of leads to this non-unified way of, non-consistent way or methodology of determining carrying capacity. It's different from one BLM district to the next. Some prefer one method over another method. And it just becomes complicated. And so you can see how the public at large, if the rangeland managers can't agree on a single unified way of determining carrying capacity, and if carrying capacity can only be estimated, and that's the only way we can do it, we can only estimate it. We can't figure the actual carrying capacity of anything, because you can't clip and weigh every plant out there in a particular area. So we can only estimate it, and if the ways of estimating it are many, several anyway, handful at best. If you can't agree on that, then how is the public at large supposed to understand what's going on? So it's just been complicated. It's been controversial, and still remains controversial even today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a very simple, sometimes crude, some people would call it crude, uh, method. It's commonly used, uh, but it's a very simple, crude way of determining carrying capacity. So that's what we're going to look at um, on Monday. I'm gonna shut it down right now uh, with this particular subject, and we'll take a look at it uh, a lot more in depth on Monday, and then we'll get you some homework next week. Let you fool around with that a little bit, and then move on to some other subjects. I think I've gotten. Uh, what did I say? I just got a deal here. The number of, and what did I don't know. Maybe I told you the wrong number a while ago. There's about 27,000 AML. That's on horses and burros. Go back up a minute. Horses and burros. I don't know what number I gave you a while ago. There's about 27,000 that's supposed to be out on the range. 26,000 and change, range wide, and we've got about 100,000, 98 to 100,000 on range right now, and Nevada has about 45,000. So Nevada has twice the range wide higher end of how many horses and burros are supposed to be out there on the range. So yeah, thanks Nathan for clearing me up. Yeah, I don't know why I said 35,000. No, it didn't get revised upward. So there's 27,000 or 26,000 and change is the real number. So I've been getting your Allison Glennie summaries. Press this back. They're looking pretty good. Some of you still don't know how many sentences 4 sentences is. So be sure you go back and look at 4 sentences in the future. We'll probably do another 1 or 2 of these. I like it. It's a good way for me to understand if you've got things organized in your mind very quickly, and I can get them graded fairly quickly. I hope you enjoyed that. I usually pull a few components or ideas out of that video, and we kind of work on them in class a little bit, and try to use some of it in thinking about some of these things that we've got to think about as we move forward the rest of the semester, some of these topics. So I hope you enjoyed that. I think it's pretty profound, and it means more than just listening. It means understanding, taking a look at things from more than just head on. You know, if you only saw an elephant from the butt end, you'd never know what an elephant looked like until you walk around to the other end and see that thing on its nose or on the other side of it. So you have to kind of kick the tires and walk around things to try and understand them, and that's sort of comparable to listening, viewing and listening and seeing things sort of in a different way from different angles. And so anyway, I kind of like her approach, and so that's why we've incorporated it here. So we're getting close to time to knock off. If you got any other questions, now's the time to shoot them to me on the live chat, and I'll try and answer them. So go. We'll see what comes over the line here pretty quick. Like I said, we got a couple of homework assignments that I'll get out to you next week, and we'll figure out what the best way to do that is going to be. If I knew everybody had access to a scanner, things would make things a lot easier, but we may not be able to do that. So I've got to make sure that I can get it to you and then get it back from you as well. What we may have to do is I'll send you the template. You work it out, and then copy it and send it back to me in one form or another. So, but we'll cross that bridge next week. I'm not getting anything from live chat here. At least not showing up yet. Give it another minute here. I did get a little blurb on the sound. Evidently, the sound did get better. Is that correct? Hopefully, it got better for everybody. Okay. Okay, cool. All right, seeing no questions, we will sign off, and we'll see you again on Monday. Try and stay safe, stay healthy. See ya.